All right, this is what we're going to do. We're going to have Jack Reed chair the meeting. Now, I'm going to be chairman. I think it may not have gone to everyone, but it seems as if the Republican Party lost the majority in the last election. And therefore, I would cease to be, in a couple of days, the chairman of the meeting. So I'm going to have Jack Reed be the chairman today so he can practice a little bit and he'll be ready to take over the chairmanship. Does that sound reasonable? No response. All right. Well, good morning. The committee meets today to receive testimony on the civilian control of the armed forces. I'd like to welcome our witnesses who are experts on the topic of civilian-military relations and the importance to implementing effective national security. They are Dr. Lindsay Kahn, currently Associate Professor at the United States Naval War College, and Dr. Kathleen McInnes, a specialist in the international security at the Congressional Research Service. We welcome both of you as expert witnesses. We had a very similar hearing before the Mattis nomination was completed. The president-elect has announced his intention to nominate Lloyd Austin to be the next Secretary of Defense. This is similar to the situation that we encountered with General Mattis 4 years ago, and the plan is to follow the same process that we used then. As we did in 2017, the first step, which we're taking today, is an outside experts hearing on civilian control of the armed services. This will be followed by a nomination hearing for General Austin, currently planned for 19 January. And I might add that I know General Austin very well, and I think the world of him, and I look forward to working with him and look forward to the two hearings we're going to have. After these two hearings are complete, the committee will vote on new legislation that would grant an exception to the longstanding law that requires a candidate to have been retired from active military service for 7 years before being appointed Secretary of Defense. Confession is good for the soul, and let me just comment here that I have never been a real believer in the 7-year thing to start with, and so I'm actually here learning, I suppose, from our two experts, like others would be at this time. So given his retirement in 2016, General Austin's nomination will require Congress to pass legislation providing an exception to the National Security Act of 1947 as amended, which stipulates the 7-year requirement. This requirement is intended to preserve civilian control of the armed forces, a bedrock principle of American democracy. It's been waived only twice in the last 70 years. As we did 4 years ago when we considered the waiver for General Mattis, we must understand why this individual is uniquely qualified at this point in time to lead the Department of Defense. I want to make it clear that the concerns I highlight regarding the A waiver are not a reflection of the personal attributes of General Austin. General Austin has a career of distinguished service to our nation, and I thank him for his willingness to serve again. In considering whether to provide a waiver, as we know, the Secretary of Defense carries a broader set of responsibilities. Beyond authority over our men and women in uniform, the Secretary must articulate, drive, and implement the nation's defense policy while managing the world's largest and most complex organization. A career in uniform certainly provides important insight, but does not necessarily prepare someone for the interagency battles engaging in the American public and congressional oversight. Upon the nomination of James Mattis 4 years ago, Leon, at my request it was, by the way, Leon Panetta, was a former Secretary of Defense, and he said, and I'm quoting now, he said, "The Secretary must exercise the ability to understand political issues, to deal with broader issues that involve your capability, and to relate to the American people." After 40 years of successful military service, it would be natural and comfortable for Lloyd Austin to surround himself with previous military colleagues who are likely make up the bulk of his contacts rather than selecting or recommending strong civilian candidates for senior service and military service. Another fair question is that if both the Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff are from the same service and have the similar military experiences, will the president get the necessary diversity of opinion and expertise required to optimally address tough national security problems? It's also reasonable to ask whether the appointment of two generals to political positions in 4 years will increase the politicization of the senior military officers corps. Over the past few years, we've seen the involvement of retired general and flag officers in political matters, including endorsement of political candidates, grow at an accelerating pace. By possibly making it the rule rather than the exception to grant a waiver, do we undermine the current norm of apolitical senior military leadership that has served this nation so well? Fundamentally, is this the decision involving civilian control of the military alongside the president's desire to nominate a cabinet member in whom he places great trust? So we need to assess, number one, what makes General Austin uniquely qualified to lead the Department of Defense? Number two, how will he ensure that civilian leadership and not the uniformed military controls policy? And three, what lessons should be drawn from the tenures of former Secretaries Mattis and Marshall? As I've said many times, this book, and I don't have it with me right now, but the Bipartisan National Defense Strategy, by the way, it's a report that we've used as a blueprint for quite some period of time. This report is the National Defense Strategy. It was put together by 12 individuals, 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats. All of them were highly qualified, and we've been using them as a guide to set our strategic competitions, including strong views on the need for healthy military-civilian balance. The Commission's report cautions, and this is quoting from the Commission, says, quote, decision-making is drifting away from civilian leaders on issues of national importance, unquote. We need to consider that warning as we take the next steps. For example, military leaders must follow orders to win battles. The civilian leaders must determine when and why to fight those battles. A profoundly different question. Let's be clear, the United States faces the most daunting set of security challenges I can recall in my lifetime: a rising China, a belligerent Russia, and the continued threat from rogue regimes and global terrorism. Confronting these threats will require innovative approaches to modernize the joint force, harness new technologies, and develop strategies to compete across all domains of warfare. We can't afford to lose time. We are already falling behind in critical capabilities like hypersonics, and our adversaries are expanding their cyber and missile defense. And I noticed that we have an expert that's going to be talking about this issue that's on the panel here with us right now. So, I've been a little bit critical of the previous administration. We actually, between the 2 years of the 5-year period between 2010 and 2015, we had an occasion to reduce our military by about 25%. At the same time, China was increasing their military by 83%. So this is something that's very much of a concern to me and a concern to several of the members of our committee. So we need to determine in this case whether what the president wants to is also the best for the nation, and the stakes couldn't be higher. So, Senator Reid, I'm going to ask you to chair this meeting since you're the one there in Washington, and also you need the practice since you're going to be the chairman in about 1 week. Okay, Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I indeed do need the practice. So you've been gracious in allowing me to do a little practicing today. But let me be very clear: Chairman Inhofe is the chairman. Let me welcome our distinguished guests, Dr. Lindsay Cohn and Dr. Kathleen McInnes, and I look forward to their testimony on the importance of civilian control of the armed services. Civilian control of the military is enshrined in our Constitution and in statute. Under current law, an individual appointed to serve as the Secretary of Defense cannot be within 7 years of active duty as a commissioned officer and the regular proponent of the armed services. 4 years ago, I raised concerns that providing an exception to General Jim Mattis to serve as the Secretary of Defense could set a precedent for future waivers. Indeed, I tried to dissuade future requests for waivers by declaring my general opposition to them, even as I supported President Trump's request. Nevertheless, President-elect Biden, exercising his rights under the Constitution, has nominated General Lloyd Austin. We now have a clearly qualified candidate and a declaration by the President-elect that he needs General Austin for the safety and security of the nation. Civil-military relations are never static and must constantly be tended to. During the 4 years since the committee last considered such a waiver, the state of civil-military relations has eroded significantly under President Trump, and the Department of Defense is in many cases adrift. This summer, emotions were high as demonstrations against police brutality erupted across the country. Rather than calm the situation, the President threatened to deploy military forces against civilian protesters under the Insurrection Act. In addition, the removal of Secretary Esper in the waning weeks of the administration was deeply troubling, as was the repeated appointment of individuals to critical national security positions within the department based on the appearance of loyalty to the President rather than the caliber of their qualifications. Compounding this problem, multiple senior-level civilian officers in the department have gone unfilled, necessitating the installment of career or mid-level officials into senior positions in an acting capacity. Finally, the President undermined our military justice system and chain of command by pardoning troops credibly accused, including by their peers, of war crimes. Moreover, we are facing extraordinary challenges. The world is engulfed in a global pandemic that has sickened millions of Americans, caused hundreds of thousands of deaths, and produced severe economic damage. We are the victim of the largest cyber breach on record perpetrated by the Russians. Last Wednesday, the Capitol was stormed by a mob whose intent was to prevent Congress from performing its constitutional duty to certify the election. This attack was the greatest threat to constitutional order in my lifetime, and it shocked our allies while giving comfort and confidence to our adversaries around the globe. When the committee considers General Austin's nomination next week, we will thoroughly review this nomination in the historic context it's being presented and the impact it will have on future generations. Therefore, as we discuss the importance of civilian control of the armed forces this morning, I hope our witnesses can speak to the following issues. First, I'd like your views on how to encourage diversity of opinion within the Department of Defense when crafting policy and making national security decisions, rather than tilting one way to the military or completely the other way to the civilian. Second, I would like our witnesses' thoughts on whether providing a waiver will encourage senior military officers to be more political, and if they believe it could lead to a situation where future presidents will default to nominating retired general officers for the position of Secretary of Defense in lieu of qualified civilians. Third, if Congress provides a waiver for General Austin, I would like our witnesses to share their thoughts on the impact this will have on the durability of the existing statute. Finally, if General Austin is ultimately confirmed as the Secretary of Defense, I would welcome any recommendations from our witnesses on actions he could take to ensure his tenure protects and promotes the principle of civilian control of the military. Civilian control of the military, consistent with the Constitution, begins and ends with the Commander-in-Chief. It is the bedrock of our democracy, and it is the principle that President-elect Biden values and respects. Serving on this committee and providing oversight of the Department of Defense is a great privilege and an enormous responsibility, one that I take seriously. The events of the past several months have thrown into sharp relief how perilously close our nation has come to undermining the resiliency of our democratic institutions. While not broken, these institutions and principles have been repeatedly subject to extreme stress. This dire situation calls for stability and a duly confirmed Secretary of Defense who has responded to Congress in the confirmation process and will be responsive to Congress as well as the President in the execution of his duties. As we hear from our witnesses today and consider an exception for General Austin to serve as the Secretary of Defense, I expect that the debate will be robust and spirited, but I'm also confident that it will be respectful, as every member of this committee cares deeply about our men and women in uniform, their families, and the civilians and contractors who serve in the Department of Defense. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And with the Chairman's direction and permission, let me recognize our witnesses for their testimony. And if Dr. Cohn, you may begin.
Good morning. Mr. Chairman, I ask that my written testimony be made a part of...
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, Senators, I am grateful for the opportunity to be here today. I would like to note that I am speaking in my personal capacity and my views do not represent those of the U.S. Naval War College or of any other organ of the U.S. government. There are important principles and values at stake here, some of which weigh for granting Mr. Austin a waiver and some of which weigh against it. I will do my best to lay out what I see as the most important issues at stake so that you can make the most informed decision possible. On the pro side are the principles that the President should generally be allowed to choose his or her own people unless there is a good reason to deny them, and that it is critical to break down the significant barriers faced by people of color and other underrepresented groups in the national security world and the world of governance more broadly. On these 2 points, Mr. Austin has a strong case. On the con side are several concerns about principles of civilian control of the military, civil-military relations more generally, and ultimately democratic governance. This is where I will focus my remarks, but I emphasize that systemic racism is as much a danger to principles of democratic governance as breakdowns in civilian control. The first point to address is why this law exists at all, as the chairman asked, what the principle of civilian control is, and why it's important. The law stems from a moment in which the U.S. was creating a permanent national defense establishment of unprecedented size, scope, and responsibility, and Congress was motivated to ensure that this establishment would be firmly under political rather than uniformed military control. Since then, the size and power of the Department of Defense has arguably grown. It remains important, therefore, that this enormous commitment of public resources and American lives be subject and accountable to political authority and not solely to its own internal judgment. The principle of civilian control is about ensuring that the military organization serves the purposes of the Republic rather than serving its own organizational judgment or purposes. There are multiple mechanisms for achieving this, and the more mechanisms there are in place, the more secure the principle is. Some of these mechanisms are appropriate for a democratic republic to use, others are not. Legitimate mechanisms include having institutional structures that place politically appointed or elected civilians in positions of authority over the highest uniformed military officers, a legal system that holds military personnel accountable to laws made by Congress, and a professional military ethic of subordination to political control. Not legitimate for a democratic republic are mechanisms like pervasive ideological surveillance enforcing loyalty to a ruling ideology, such as was seen in the Soviet military, and a technique sometimes called ethnic stacking, which involves making the officer corps consist largely of whatever demographic group holds political power, so that officers will identify with and defend the interests of the group in power. These are inappropriate for the fairly evident reason that the military ought to serve the interests of the Republic as a whole, not of any particular political party or demographic group within it. This is why there must be strong institutional means of control in place to avoid political attempts to control the military through personal or ideological loyalty. The civilian in civilian control can refer to several elements, but the important one here is the logic that a person applies to strategic planning and policy decision-making, a political logic of achieving aims specifically in the public or national interest, or a military logic. For those within the military, it is natural to want to approach a fight with overwhelming resources, overwhelming force, and few limitations on how they can employ that force. This is how to win battles with the smallest losses on your own side. But this logic cannot be allowed to override the political logic of why force is being used in the first place. In sum, the principle of civilian or political control of the military is central both to healthy democratic governance and to effective use of force for political ends. One of the several important mechanisms for exercising that control is civilian political appointees exercising political rather than military logic in positions of authority. So those are the concerns relating to civilian control. There are also concerns relating to issues of civil-military relations and governance. The first is that granting this waiver would weaken the principle that civilians should be in control of the Defense Department and would very likely lead to more appointments of recently retired officers. Should that happen, there is the potential for further politicization of the officer corps, by which I mean an undesirable increase in either the reality or perception of military officers engaging in the usually partisan struggle for political power within the domestic system, something we have already noted as unhealthy. Third is that this appointment is likely to strengthen a general perception that military experience and expertise are the same thing as security, defense, or foreign policy expertise. They are not the same, and it is important that both be well represented in defense and security policy making. In short, as Hamilton warned, if the people believe that only professional military officers understand how to protect them, it is a short step to the belief that only professional military officers know how to govern them. Fourth is the issue of public trust in the system and in political institutions. Choosing a recently retired general officer and arguing that he is uniquely qualified to meet the current challenges furthers a narrative that military officers are better at things and more reliable or trustworthy than civil servants or other civilians. This is hugely problematic at a time when one of the biggest challenges facing the country is the need to restore trust and faith in the political system. Implying that only a military officer can do this job at this time is counterproductive to that goal. There is also a danger that elected officials may use the public's trust in the military to avoid difficult parts of politics. Military personnel should not be used as shields for political choices. In order to restore trust and confidence in the system, elected officials must embrace the responsibility of making the public case for difficult choices. While I've argued that this nomination is troubling on grounds of healthy governance and institutions, there are several ways that these concerns could be mitigated, things that both these chambers and Mr. Austin and the Biden administration can do. I've outlined these in my written statement, and I'm happy to elaborate. There are ways in which granting this waiver and confirming Mr. Austin will make efforts to restore trust in the political system more difficult. Should this chamber choose that path, it will be important to ensure that the administration is doing what it can to rebuild civilian expertise and authority in the Department of Defense and the government more broadly. In other ways, Mr. Austin may be the right person for the job at this moment. The President-elect will need his team to work together smoothly and seamlessly to deal with the extreme challenges they face, both domestically and abroad. Mr. Austin's leadership could be a step in the right direction of diversifying the upper levels of the national security establishment. Our country faces a difficult time, and the incoming administration must balance a number of competing priorities, central among them the need to restore the legitimacy of the principles and institutions of democratic governance. Mr. Austin's nomination will neither heal nor break American democracy by itself, but it is a critical node in the web. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much. And let me now recognize our other witness, Dr. McGinnis. Thank you, Doctor. And just a reminder, if you can stay close to the 5 minutes, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I ask that my written testimony may be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, for the opportunity to join you this morning to discuss civilian control of the armed forces. It is an honor to be here for this conversation on behalf of the Congressional Research Service. The Founding Fathers placed limits on the armed forces in order to ensure that the military is both subordinate and accountable to the political leadership of the United States. Control of the armed forces is a shared responsibility of both the executive and legislative branches. Tensions arise, of course, but the fundamental subordination of the military to the civilians that they serve has remained intact due to careful oversight and daily management by both branches of the U.S. government. 150 years after the founding, the experience of World War II convinced many, including President Truman, of the need for greater coordination of a larger standing military in a single defense department. Yet concerns were raised that a single individual serving as head of all the U.S. armed forces might become too powerful, and even more so if that person had previously served as a military officer. This concern led to the provision commonly referred to as the cooling-off period between military service and SecDef appointment. At the time, the period was 10 years. In 2008, Congress reduced it to 7 years. There have been 2 exceptions to that waiting period, for General Marshall in 1950 and for General Mattis in 2017. 4 years ago, this committee heard testimony on the risks that confirming a recently retired general officer into the position of Secretary of Defense might introduce. It was observed that tactical and operational leadership, especially within a deeply hierarchical and nonpartisan institution like the military, does not necessarily provide adequate preparation for the complexity of a Secretary of Defense's inherently political roles. The position of Secretary of Defense is unique within the U.S. government. They serve as the principal advisor to the President on defense matters. They are the only unelected civilian leader in the military chain of command. They are responsible for adjudicating budget disputes. They represent DoD in interagency discussions. They serve as a key node for Congress's oversight and civilian control of the military. They manage one of the largest workforces in the world. They serve as a point of communication between the Department of Defense and the American public, and all the while, they must constantly and vigorously protect the military from politicization. Those tasks are a tall order for anybody. So, success depends upon the health of the Department of Defense as an institution, and in particular, the Office of the Secretary of Defense. The latter helps the Secretary provide routine civilian oversight over the department. A growing chorus of defense experts argue that those civilian institutions are now at a low point. Some reasons for this assessment include failures to nominate and confirm experienced and effective political appointees, which has allowed, if not encouraged, other institutions in DoD to marginalize civilian leadership on matters such as planning, and mandated headquarters personnel reductions, which have served to increase the workload on a shrinking staff in the face of an increasingly dangerous strategic landscape. According to this view, in order for the Secretary to provide effective authority, direction, and control over the armed forces, these institutions ought to be revitalized. Now, these issues existed when Secretary Mattis assumed the reins of the Department of Defense, and for a variety of reasons, they have since accelerated. Observers argue that the net result has been to create an inversion of the civilian-military relations dialogue, with the military now more dominant on defense matters on a day-to-day basis than their civilian counterparts. This is why the Bipartisan National Defense Strategy Commission stated that they were struck by the imbalance of civilian and military voices on critical issues of strategy development and implementation. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution grants Congress the power to raise and supervise the military, and by extension, the Pentagon. Many observers therefore contend that a top priority for the Secretary of Defense, in partnership with Congress, should be to revitalize and improve DoD's civilian institutions and workforce. Put a bit differently, considerable time and attention is paid to the health of the military's personnel, equipment, and so on, yet there's no comparable metrics for civilian workforce health and readiness. Regardless of who ultimately sits in the position of Secretary of Defense, addressing this matter is an option Congress might want to consider in order to revitalize civilian control of the military and ensure our civilian institutions are robust enough to do their work effectively. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, the American government wields its power through the consent of the governed. The founders intended that this principle would apply unambiguously to the military as well. Thank you, and I await your questions.
Thank you very much. And now, on behalf of Chairman Inhofe, let me recognize Chairman Inhofe for his questions.
Well, thank you, Senator Reid. I think it'd be a good idea, and since I mentioned that I didn't believe that a waiting period was really necessary, so it wouldn't be necessary to waive it. Although I've studied a little bit more in the opening statements of both of our witnesses. And so let me just do this. I'm going to go ahead and read that part of the Title 10 that is verbatim here. Quote, I'm quoting now, there is a Secretary of Defense who's the head of the Department of Defense appointed from civilian life by the President by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. A person may not be appointed as Secretary of Defense within 7 years after release from active duty as a commissioned officer of a regular component of the armed forces. Now, Dr. Khan, you know, this is kind of arbitrary, I guess, the 7 years. Is there a reason for 7 years instead of 4 years or 1 year or in general? Is this a threshold that we ought to keep or should change, maybe be considered?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You are correct. The number 7 is somewhat arbitrary. The original number 10 was also arbitrary. It was a nice round number. And 7 was the compromise between leaving it at 10 and reducing it to 5, which was the debate that came up in 2007, 2008. However, I do think that 7 years is actually a good period because, as multiple people have pointed out, it allows a minimum of 2 rotations for military deployments and assignments, which means that that allows time for the command relationships and the people in those command positions to change significantly from the time that the recently retired officer was in a position of command. That helps in a lot of ways to mitigate the problem that both you and Mr. Ranking Member mentioned about Mr. Mattis relying heavily on his network of military contacts. Thank you.
Well, we're suffering from some interruptions right now, and I can't tell, Senator Reed, can you tell from where you are what's the cause of those?
No, sir, but
some members need to put their microphones on mute. Dick, you need to be on mute. Dick Blumenthal, you're not on mute, so we're getting back from you. And anyone else who's not on mute needs to mute their screens. That's the back sound.
All right, that sounds good to me. All right, we read that, but I also, in my opening statement, I talked about the NDS, the commission that was, and we're following that pretty closely. I'm going to go ahead and read what that commission says. Now, this is the NDS. I don't have that with me right now, but I do have the quote from it. It says, the report states civilian voices have been relatively muted on issues at the center of the U.S. defense and national security policy, undermining the concept of civilian control. The implementation of the NDS must feature empowered civilians fulfilling their statutory responsibilities, particularly regarding the issues of force management. So starting with Dr. Khan and then Dr. McGinnis, do you agree with the assessment by the NDS Commission that, quote, civilian voices are relatively muted? And if so, why is this such a big problem in our democracy? Dr. Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would say yes, I do agree with that assessment. I think that the civilian side of the Department of Defense has lost both influence and respect over the last several years. And I think that is a problem for the reasons outlined in my written testimony in terms of the need for diverse experiences and particularly the need for an understanding of what I have called political logic. That is, people who are dedicated to thinking about defense and security in policy terms and not just in what we might think of as practical military terms. I think that the military side is well represented in the debates internal to the department. What's happening now that is the civilian side is less well represented, and that creates an imbalance and I think produces worse policy. Thank you, sir.
Well, and Dr. McGinnis, do you agree? I think the key part there is civilian voices are relatively muted. Do you think so?
Senator, there is considerable evidence that's part of the public record now that suggests that that is indeed the case, that comports with the National Defense Strategy Commission's assessment. It's worth noting that the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the civilian voices that are in this case being relatively muted, is the practical eyes, arms, ears, legs of the Secretary of Defense. They are there to do the day-to-day work of civilian oversight of the military. They write this, they work with their counterparts overseas to understand political and military dynamics that might impact the national security of the United States. They go to war zones and help military commanders really understand secretary's intent. They are the practical, where the rubber meets the road of civilian-military relations. The Office of the Secretary of Defense is where it happens. And according to the National Defense Strategy Commission, as well as, again, a growing chorus of voices that I referred to in my opening statement, those civilian voices are relatively muted now. A couple of reasons that are worth calling attention to include, again, this question of appointment of political appointees within the system, the failure to do so, and having civil servants being in acting capacities has served to, if there's nobody in the civilian side of the house to do the work, then the advice, the decisions on matters of national strategy are going to migrate inherently to the institutions that are appropriately staffed. Why does this matter? I refer once again to the National Defense Strategy and the National Defense Strategy Commission's reports. The NDSC Commission notes that China is engaged in a whole-of-society strategy to accomplish its objectives, many of which are counter to U.S. objectives. The political military nature of the security environment which we are operating in requires political military connections and connective tissue between the military instrument and the broader political objectives of this country and the broader prerogatives of the president himself. Without the civilian side of the house, without that civilian pillar being able to do its job effectively, we are missing a critical voice, a critical note, a critical connective tissue in this discussion, if you agree with the National Defense Strategy Commission's report on this matter.
Well, we're going to be having the hearing coming up, so if a waiver is granted, I'd like to ask each one of you, what types of questions should we ask to mitigate some of the potential problems that might come with having the waiver granted? Hear from both of you, Dr. Khan and Dr. McGinnis. What should we be pursuing in the hearing in the event that this waiver is granted?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think a couple of questions that you ought to ask Mr. Austin would include things like how he plans to demonstrate his commitment to empowering the civilian side of the Department of Defense, how he plans to foster relationships of respect and trust between the civilian staff and the uniformed staff. I think you should ask him how he sees the differences between his role as a military commanding officer and his role as the Secretary of Defense, and you should want to know that he is committed to the idea of being a political actor and no longer a military actor receiving and obeying orders or simply giving military advice, that he should be willing to engage with the press, willing to be transparent with Congress, with this committee and with the House Armed Services Committee, and that he should generally express an understanding of the different nature of the role that he will be playing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. McGinnis. What do you think?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The question invites us to consider that the Secretary of Defense is one person that's put in an institutional role that is inherently political, inherently multifaceted. as one scholar put it, it's the impossible job within the department because there's so much to it. And therefore, the health of the institution of the Department of Defense is critically important to ensuring that the day-to-day business, any strengths, weaknesses, whatever, are managed, and that the business of national security can be advanced. So in order to be effective, the Secretary of Defense needs to have the confidence of the President, the Congress, and the military and the Department of Defense. So to that end, if you are interested in teasing out whether those relationships will be solid and comport with what you would like to see, some suggestions might include, whether or not the nominee would be amenable to taking a close look at the health of the civilian workforce. Also, with respect to relations with the Congress, one proposal that was tabled last time when it was the nomination of Secretary Mattis was considered, was whether or not the then nominee Mattis would testify in front of the House Armed Services Committee. That might be another option to consider.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank the witnesses again. And I think the chairman has really focused in on some of the critical questions that we have to address. But one point is my reflection on the context of the National Defense Strategy Commission is that the authors detected this decline in civilian authority over several years. It wasn't an abrupt change as a result of General Mattis or anyone else. So this is a tendency that was happening even when we had civilians as Secretary of Defense. Is that accurate in your view? Thank you.
Yes,
go ahead.
Yes, that is accurate.
Yeah. So we have, regardless of who the nominee is, a challenge to restore a much stronger balance of civilian control. And one factor, particularly if General Austin is indeed confirmed, would be to put robust civilians as quickly as possible into critical roles like the Undersecretary, Deputy Secretary, the Policy Secretary. Is that a strong view that you would share, Dr. Cohn?
Yes, Senator, I think so, very much.
Dr. McGinnis?
The analysis would suggest that, sir.
Yes. And, I do think that the Chairman's questions about the issues we should raise, your responses were quite good, in fact, very good, which is basically the understanding that General Austin would have of a new role, which is not similar to, and I believe he's intelligent enough to grasp this, but he has to demonstrate not only an intellectual but also a sort of complete commitment to this, which is to understand that he is in a political role, bureaucratic politics, not electoral politics, but bureaucratic politics, and that he has to rely, frankly, if he's given this opportunity, on the expertise of others that have much more of that experience, and I think that is consistent with your comments too. The other aspect of this is that even though he is clearly a professional, in fact, a superb professional military officer, many of his tasks, certainly as the CENTCOM commander, put him face to face with the with very difficult political judgments. So in that context, would you think he would have some insights already into the political dynamics of national security policy? Dr. Cohn?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, of course, anyone who reaches the level of 4 stars has political experience of the type involving diplomatic efforts, thinking about policy significance. They have, of course, been asked to provide advice to policymakers. So he certainly has some of this experience. And no one is questioning either his competency or his savvy in terms of understanding political implications. I think the main differences that I would point out are, first of all, his, let's say, default logic when he comes to dealing with problems and issues, and whether the first thing that he thinks of is how to achieve larger political goals using a wide array of tools and mechanisms, or whether he thinks of it from the perspective of an army officer. Mm-hmm. And the other thing, again, is that there are multiple meanings of political. What you have described is political in the sense that it is dealing with bargaining, and that is important. But there is also political in the sense of the power dynamic, especially the partisan power dynamic, within domestic politics and the domestic system. And this is something that Mr. Austin will be aware of, but will never have had to personally play in. And that, I think, is something, and we saw with Mr. Mattis that was something he was very uncomfortable doing, and that is problematic given, as Dr. McInnes has described, the role of the Secretary of Defense. Thank you.
Dr. McInnes, brief comments. I only have about 20 seconds.
Sure. The question invites us to consider the role of a combatant commander, a four-star a general officer, and the experiences that they've had. A four-star combatant commander has had lots of experience at the pointy end of the spear, and there's a lot of political military dynamics associated with that, as you point out. But spears have a huge shaft as well. There's a whole lot that goes into making the pointy end of the spear effective. Mm-hmm. And as a result, as applied to the Department of Defense, there's Title X responsibilities, there's strategy. All kinds of different things that the Secretary is responsible for. So in consideration of this question of civilian-military relations, it invites us to consider the broader team and how the broader team is going to be able to handle these responsibilities on behalf of the nation. National security is a team sport.
Thank you very much. And I would ask my colleagues to try to adhere as close as possible to the 5-minute rule. And with that, on behalf of Chairman Inhofe, I'd like to recognize Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Senator Reid. I'd like to explore a little bit further the quote that Senator Inhofe used in the 2018 report of the National Defense Strategy Commission, where concern was expressed about the state of civil-military relations at the time. Dr. McInnes and Dr. Cohn, what is your assessment of the current state of civilian-military relations, and do you agree that this is a trend which is moving in the wrong direction?
Thank you, Senator. The evidence out there does comport with the National Defense Strategy Commission's assessment of civilian-military relations. And it is up to this committee to determine whether you agree with this assessment, but it does suggest that if the civilian pillar within the Department of Defense is not up to optimum health, and as you rightly point out, these are long-standing trends. Furloughs, headquarters reductions, political appointments. These are issues that go back at least a decade. And have accumulated over time. So if we do want to see healthy civilian-military relations being conducted on a day-to-day basis, it would argue for paying attention to the health of the civilian workforce and the political appointees, the team that is put in to support whoever the Secretary of Defense will be.
What do you think is the most concerning aspect of it? The example the Commission uses is the empowerment of the Joint Staff at the expense of civilian staff within the office of the Secretary. Are there other examples? And Dr. Cohn, please jump in as well.
There are a variety of manifestations of this issue. One being, again, the failure to have confirmed political appointees within positions, which combatant commanders, the Joint Staff, when they look for civilian guidance and they are confronted with an acting who does not have the authority for the department to make decisions in the way that somebody who's been confirmed does. They naturally sort of, it's human nature. They just sort of go around that. But then there's also procedure elements of this as well. Dr. Mara Carlin notes that there are a number of provisions in statute with respect to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff's role, statutory responsibilities that sort of overlap with civilian dimensions of policymaking in the department. And in procedure, there's just how a policy, how an instruction is staffed out, and how the war plans are staffed out, and how the review process works within process matters in the Pentagon, as you know. But looking at some of these instructions, the routine, halfway marks, waypoints, checkpoints within the process seem to have not included civilian voices in those in the procedures.
Okay, Dr. Cohn, if you'd like to speak to that, and also, do you think that when we create exemptions and allow recently retired officers to serve as Secretary of Defense, does that influence this issue at all?
Thank you, Senator. To answer your second question first, yes, I think it does, of course, weaken the norm or the principle, and I think that should be an issue of concern for you as you make this decision. But of course, whether it undermines the norm completely is up to you in the future. You will have the opportunity to make this decision again, and you can change the direction of that norm. In terms of the civil-military relationships, both within the Department of Defense and more broadly in society, I think what we have seen is a really troubling set of mutually reinforcing trends, negative trends. As Dr. McInnes has described, in the department you have many, many years' worth of hiring freezes, personnel cuts, difficulty filling positions with Senate-confirmed members and using acting people or leaving them vacant. And that is extremely troubling. But this is reinforced by a larger situation in the American public of a worrying trend of over-deference to military expertise and military experience, and a worrying trend of less interest in active self-governance and a sort of willingness to turn over decision-making to the military. And I think these trends are both troubling, they are mutually reinforcing, and they should be something that this chamber seriously considers as something that needs to be addressed going forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Reid.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. And again, on behalf of Chairman Inhofe, let me recognize Senator Shaheen.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this hearing. And one of the things that has come up several times in your responses, Dr. Cohn and Dr. McInnes, has been the operating within a partisan environment, which we know is very much the case right now in Washington, and that the country is very divided. And this is not exactly on point for the waiver, but I think it is another troubling trend within the military. And you mentioned this, Dr. McInnes, in your June 2020 CRS report on the military, that you highlight the importance of civilian control, but you also reference that the nonpartisan culture of the military is one of the reasons that it has enjoyed such a high regard in the American public. And I think one of the more recent polls had 73% of Americans who viewed the military with high regard. But one of the things that is troubling is that we're seeing more and more partisanship within the military. And so I wonder, as you're thinking about the waiver issue and about what we need to ensure the division between civilian and military control, if you can speak to whether this is an issue that is going to be affected by granting another waiver and having further military control of the Department of Defense. And how should we handle that erosion of the nonpartisanship within the military? Are there things that Congress and the executive branch should be doing to address that. We saw it again in the insurrection at the Capitol on the 6th, that there were a number of former military and actually at least one active military participant in that who has since resigned. So as we think about the challenges, how should we be thinking about that aspect of what's going on within the military? Dr. McGinnis, maybe you could begin.
Actually, if it's okay, I'd like to turn to Dr. Cohn, who has written extensively on this matter.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Senator, for these questions. I would say I think your analysis is correct. I would say there are a couple of things that can be done to deal with this problem in some ways. And the two most important ones that I can think of are that elected officials in general, both in the executive and in the legislative branches, should work to protect the military from partisan politics. Do not use them as props. Do not use them as shields. Do not base your arguments for legislation on the effect that they will have on members of the military and their families and veterans. These are all, of course, very important things. Members of the military and their families and veterans have needs, but they are not the only reason to pass legislation, and it's important not to give that impression to the American people that that's the only justification for many things that need to be done for other reasons. So protect the military from partisan politics. In terms of what it has to do with this particular nomination, I would say that the biggest mitigating factor would be to encourage Mr. Austin to emphasize his new role and his separation from his military role, and the fact that what he is doing is a different kind of thing than what military officers do. And I think that those two things should help. In the end, however, partisan polarization is a broad social phenomenon, and our military is, of course, representative of our public, or at least we hope to keep it that way. And any phenomena that show up in the broader society will affect the military. So in the end, we have to work on partisan polarization as a larger problem in order to heal it within the military. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. McGinnis, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yes, I was struck as Dr. Cohn was speaking about some of the other broader trends that are factor in play in this discussion, which is, over the years, the U.S. military has seen the lion's share of resources allocated towards it, and a lion's share of attention allocated towards it when it comes to matters of national security relative to institutions like the State Department and USAID. So there is a shift towards focusing on the Department of Defense. Tasks, missions are going over to the Department of Defense as a result, and that sort of raises questions about how we think about what the military does for national security, what's its appropriate role, and have we gotten that right?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I think I'm out of time, but it speaks to the need to rebalance the role of our State Department and our Department of Defense, so that our State Department is doing the diplomacy that is required before we would call in troops to address conflicts and other issues. Thank you both very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. On behalf of Chairman Inhofe, let me recognize Senator Cotton.
Thank you, Senator Reid. I want to thank both of our witnesses for appearing. I want to make an observation up front. When we talk about civilian control of the military and the implications for this waiver, I don't think anyone believes that civilian control of the military is seriously at risk from Lloyd Austin's nomination. We all have immense respect for Lloyd Austin and his service in uniform. We have immense respect for General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and the other senior leaders of our armed forces and our combatant commands. So the question we're really facing here is whether the experiences and the skills and the relationships that career military officers bring to the job after being recently retired is right for that job. So I want to speak first to our witnesses about some perceptions. Ms. Cohn, you write the idea that we're going to confirm recently retired flag officers to be Secretary of Defense 2 administrations in a row could help create the perception that the terminal point in one's military career is not being a four-star officer, but rather being Secretary of Defense. Is there any way that we can avoid that perception, given the fact that actions speak louder than words, if we move forward with this waiver?
Thank you, Senator. As I said, I do think that granting 2 waivers in a row will seriously weaken the norm of this being an exception rather than the rule. I do think that it will seriously implicate, this problem that exactly the way you describe it, that the culmination of an officer's career is not 4-star, but Secretary of Defense. Can that be mitigated? That will be difficult. I think the only way that this chamber can mitigate that is to be very, very clear in the specific reasons that they think Mr. Austin is the right person for this job at this time, and especially to maintain the statute as it stands, not to simply think that, well, we've granted 2 exceptions in a row and therefore the statute is dead and doesn't really count as law anymore, but to emphasize that this chamber really believes in the principle and is making an exception to what they think is an important rule. Thank you.
And also, you point out a couple other perceptions I won't dwell on, is that you say the perception of expertise residing in military officers only, and you distinguish, I think, capably between military expertise on the one hand and security or foreign policy expertise on the other hand, and then, of course, the perception of possible favoritism or chauvinism for one service or one regional combatant command. I want to move on next to the political nature of this job. Not the partisan nature, but the inherently political nature. When a Secretary of Defense has to engage in sometimes heated political disputes with inside the Department of Defense, between services and between combatant commands and agencies, with senior staff at the White House, within the cabinet over budgetary priorities, with Congress over similar priorities. He has to engage with the media as well. I point out that in my lifetime, I think 4 of the most consequential and successful Secretaries of Defense all had significant political experience. 3 of them had partisan experience, either Cap Weinberger, Dick Cheney, Leon Panetta, and then Bob Gates. He had partisan experience, but I think he writes in his memoirs he had a lot of political experience from his career as a civilian official at the CIA, and then a lot of political experience being a university president at Texas A&M as well. Ms. Cohn, does the skills and experiences that you gain in the military, which is inherently apolitical and designed to be so in our republic, prepare you for all of those political disputes that you might have as Secretary of Defense?
Senator, I think the short answer to that is no. I think obviously the experience you gain as a 4-star military officer is immense. It's important. It's helpful to understanding all of the things that need to be done to understanding many of the things that need to be done in the Department of Defense. But as you point out, many of our most successful Secretaries of Defense have not only extensive interagency experience, but sometimes also legislative experience. And it is simply not the case that a military officer who has spent his or her entire career, again, 4-star officers, the higher you get in the military hierarchy, the more alike those officers are. And many of them come from combat arms backgrounds, like yourself. And that is a certain type of experience that is important and helpful, but I do not think comprehensive in the way that you would want a Secretary of Defense to have experience. Thank you.
All right, thank you. One final question. On page 10 of your testimony, you assessed the tenures of Secretary Marshall and Secretary Mattis. I commend everyone to read those brief histories. Were those tenures, after they had received these waivers, successes to be repeated or cautionary tales about the wisdom of this 7-year cooling off period?
Senator, I think as Dr. McInnes has really ably demonstrated, the job of Secretary of Defense is incredibly difficult and almost no one is ever really prepared for it. However, I think that both the tenures of Secretary Marshall and Secretary Mattis basically reinforced the concerns of the members of Congress who made that initial statute. They relied very heavily on their military networks. They seemed to be uncomfortable dealing with political issues and, in Marshall's case, with protecting the president from an overambitious regional operational commander. So I do not think that these were shining examples of the best that we can do with secretaries of defense.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. And again, on behalf of Chairman Inhofe, let me recognize Senator Gillibrand.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 4 years ago, we had a hearing like this, and Dr. Kathleen Hicks, who's now President-elect Biden's Deputy Secretary of Defense designate, argued before this committee that those civilians ought to almost always serve as Secretary of Defense. Mattis's unique qualifications and checks in the system justify the one-time exception to the rule. She added that she didn't think Mattis's appointment would set a, quote, new precedent, and that she, quote, would not imagine in the next 20 plus years that we would see ourselves back in this hearing of this nature, end of quote. Okay, well, we are here again. Dr. Cohn, in your written testimony, you say that Austin's waiver could be justified because he's who President-elect wants and because the symbol of having black men as secretary is important. On the other hand, you write, Mattis got the waiver because many hoped he would help hold Trump in check. Am I correct that these waivers have been justified on two different rationales? Yes. Dr. Cohn, if each time the president nominates a new general to serve as Secretary of Defense, Congress grants a waiver based on a new rationale, aren't we just saying that the president gets to choose his or her Secretary of Defense regardless of their recent military experience?
Yes, Senator, I think that is what you would be saying if this chamber decided to consistently grant a waiver every time one was asked for. And I do acknowledge that granting two waivers in a row, I argue that granting two waivers in a row begins to lead down that path. I do not think that going down that path is absolutely inevitable. Again, that really is up to this chamber and how it describes its reasoning in whatever decision it finally takes.
Dr. Cohn, 4 years ago, Dr. Hicks said that our system of civil-military relations is, quote, strong enough to withstand any risk. A once-in-two-generation exception could pose, and, quote, if we're granting a twice-in-one-decade exception for back-to-back administrations, what kind of system are we actually protecting?
Again, Senator, I think you're absolutely correct to point out that granting two waivers in a row is a very different thing from granting one waiver under the impression that you will not be asked to do this again anytime soon. I think that this chamber has a very difficult decision in front of it to decide whether the reasons that the president-elect has given and the reasons that you all can think of yourself justify granting another waiver, because I think it is a dangerous precedent to grant two in a row. Yes.
So I want to highlight a few of the added risks of normalizing the idea that a senior general could become Secretary of Defense relatively quickly after he or she retires. Dr. Cohn, a year into the Trump administration, you wrote that, quote, reverence for the military has come to distort and manipulate public discourse, end of quote. And that scholars hope that Trump's use of generals in civilian policymaking roles was, quote, an exception to an important rule, not the beginning of a new normal, end of quote. You worried that ongoing veneration of military expertise would have, quote, devastating implication for U.S. policy, both foreign and domestic. Do you believe that President-elect Biden's choice of a retired general and not any one of the number of well-qualified civilians dangerously inflates the perceived value of military expertise in a way that weakens our policymaking?
Senator, in my personal opinion, yes. The answer to that is yes. I am still concerned about these things. I think the health of civil-military relations is under threat, and I do think that this could lead to a larger problem, yes.
Okay, so I want to give you an example of why this concerns me so much. In the wake of the disappearance and murder of Specialist Vanessa Diaz, the Army commissioned an independent review that investigated the command climate, violent crime, and sexual assault and harassment at Fort Hood. I asked because the military has commissioned a number of reports and panels on sexual assault during the several years I've been on this committee. But this is the first report that I've seen that was not written by DoD personnel. And it found that Fort Hood has an ongoing crisis of violent crime, sexual assault, harassment, and that soldiers don't trust leaders and commanders up and down the ranks to fix because they help to create that climate. Would you agree that the crisis in confidence facing Fort Hood's commanders is alarming? And do you agree that it would be reasonable to suspect that the trends described in the Fort Hood report could very well exist, though perhaps to a lesser degree, at other large operational bases? And do you believe that if you were in uniform, if you were one of these young women at Fort Hood who fears that she's going to be raped or murdered when she is moving around the base at night, you would be reticent to trust someone to solve these problems who so recently wore the same uniform as the commanders who have failed you?
Senator, yes, the report about Fort Hood certainly alarms me. Yes, I would imagine that those kinds of problems exist elsewhere as well. Would I therefore not trust someone who came out of that institution to fix these problems? I think that would depend more on the individual. I would not simply assume that anyone coming from the military institution was unable to address these problems. We have multiple examples of people within the military institution who take these problems very seriously. So I think that I absolutely agree that these problems are very serious and they must be addressed. And if Mr. Austin is confirmed, I hope that he makes them a high priority. But I would not think that he would be disqualified on that ground alone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Gillibrand. And on behalf of Chairman Inhofe, let me recognize Senator Rounds.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Let me just walk my way through this a little bit. After listening to the testimony here, I come from the camp that the President of the United States should have the ability to choose the people that he believes are best suited for the job in hand. And as our panelists have indicated, this is one of those impossible jobs. At this time, we have a president who has nominated a very qualified gentleman in General Austin with an impeccable service record. At the same time, the president has basically ignored what was a precedent that Congress has set in the past, which would require the 7-year waiting period. And there was good reason for it. What I haven't seen yet is the president's logic or his full explanation about why he has asked us to basically once again step away from what was established law, and what was the overriding reason why this particular individual would be better than other individuals who would qualify. And I think the president still owes us that answer. And I don't think that's something that General Austin should have to answer. I think that's something which the president should share. But once again, I think tie goes to the president in the end, and I'm torn on this. The other thing that I guess I would ask our panelists, I think that in many ways, one of the reasons why a general officer is being nominated is because of the respect the American people have for an individual in that position. The fact that they are, in many ways, nonpartisan or apolitical, and that's something that many of us want to see within the military. And so to have an individual that has that as part of their background is, in my opinion, not a negative. And in fact, I think that tells people that this is not going to be a politically charged position. I'd like the thoughts from our panelists about that and whether or not that is an attribute that that is something worth considering in a case like this. I'd like to begin with that. And Dr. Cohen, would you like to begin? Give me your thoughts about whether or not that as an attribute in terms of the expertise and the confidence the American people have, whether or not that is something that we should also value as well.
Thank you for the question, Senator. Is it a good thing that this indicates that the Secretary of Defense position would not be politically charged, as you put it? I understand your point, and I think that that is certainly part of, I cannot speak for the President-elect, but I think that is part of his logic, that he is trying to signal to the public. He has made it clear that he wants to signal to the public that he wants to be a unifier, that he wants to try to bring people together. And it is possible that he hopes that in nominating someone from, as Dr. McInnes described, an apolitical background will help do that. What I would argue is that, again, I might call that political laziness. I don't want to accuse anyone of vices, but the problem there is that if we have to rely on military officers for their military officer status in order to regain trust in the government, that is a problem. And it is certainly the case that the American public respects the military a great deal. And it is certainly the case that hopefully the American public will look at Mr. Austin and think this is someone who hasn't taken part in the ugly fighting that we have seen. But I don't think it's good to encourage that trend. Is it the end of the world if this happens this time? I don't know. I don't think so. But I don't think it's good to encourage the trend. Thank you. Thank you.
Dr. McInnes?
Thank you, Senator. I think that it's a complicated tension. The military is a nonpartisan institution, but the Department of Defense, and in particularly the Secretary of Defense, is a part of a political administration. And so as a result, there is a question that can arise if we have military officers transitioning into these inherently political roles. Does that start creating questions in the American people's minds as to whether or not the Department of Defense, or what are the roles and responsibilities? What is nonpartisanship? Is the military truly nonpartisan? I think those are fair questions to explore.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I suspect my time is pretty close to being up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Round. And now on behalf of Chairman Inhofe, let me recognize Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank you and Senator Inhofe for holding this very important hearing. Civilian control of the military is a bedrock principle of our democracy, and it's the reason for this statute, and it is also the reason why Congress, in passing the statute, said specifically no additional appointment of military men to that office shall be approved, in talking about then General Marshall. We are now in danger of setting a precedent after precedent with a new norm, in effect, creating the danger that the exception will swallow the rule. The reason for the principle of civilian control is not only to protect our democracy against military interference, it is to protect the military against excessive interference, political, partisan interference that may jeopardize the professionalism and effectiveness of our military. I have immense respect and admiration for General Austin. I told him so just yesterday when I met with him. For me, it is a matter of principle. It's not personal. And in fact, in our very serious and substantive discussion, General Austin indicated his profound and deep respect for that principle. And he actually alluded to specific ways that the principle of civilian control could be strengthened if he is confirmed. For example, taking back some of the power that has devolved to the chiefs of staff, taking back the pen, essentially, from them in certain key areas, and also greater transparency with the Congress and the public, specifically with our committee, more regular reporting. And I am heartened and encouraged by his suggestion that there are ways that civilian control can be strengthened. But what we've seen in recent years, as Senator Reid indicated, is a tendency and trend toward, in effect, weak civilian control, a change in the balance that is dangerous for our democracy. The Trump administration left vacant a slew of key civilian positions, in fact, 40% of them in the Department of Defense. The president used, as he put it, my generals, in effect, to give himself credibility in areas where he completely lacked it. Fortunately, President-elect Biden has that credibility, and I have no doubt that he will not use the military in the way that President Trump did. But clearly, President Trump has degraded the independence of the military and ignored some of the dangerous tendencies of political activity within the military and white supremacy, the involvement of perhaps some of the active duty armed forces or reserves or retired military in the mob assault last Wednesday. These kinds of dangerous tendencies need to be effectively countered and disciplined and investigated by the next Secretary of Defense as a civilian, taking control of the military in ways that may create some adversarial relationships. And the next Secretary of Defense must be prepared to demonstrate that kind of independence. I think that what we have ahead is a very serious challenge. I want to make sure that we avoid the perception of Republican generals and Democratic generals, which again is the perception that President Trump's misuse of the military may have tended to create. And I believe strongly that it is a matter of principle. Therefore, I will oppose the waiver in this instance, as I did with General Mattis, whom I also deeply respected and admired and said so. I believe that I may be in the minority, but I think it is a matter of very deeply important principle. And I would ask our witnesses whether they feel there are specific steps that we can ask of General Austin to effectively perhaps counteract the dilution of the balance that we think is so important to our nation and civilian control over the military. I recognize that my time may have expired, and so I would take those answers for the record if the chairman wants to move to another senator.
Senator Blumenthal, I would accept your suggestion that they be taken for the record so that we can fairly allocate the time to all of our colleagues. Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Now, on behalf of Chairman Inhofe, let me recognize Senator Sullivan. Senator Sullivan, are you? Who's the next? This is remarkable because I'm impressed. This is the first technical glitch we've had, so we're doing pretty well. What? We'll try to connect with Senator Sullivan. Let me now recognize Senator Kramer on behalf of Senator Inhofe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Reid and Chairman Inhofe, both of you. And thanks to the witnesses. I think for me to ask a question at this point would be redundant, quite honestly, because we've done a pretty good job of exhausting, I think, the topic. However, I would say, just make a couple of comments. First of all, thank you to the two witnesses. You've been absolutely fantastic. You've helped me think this through in more ways with more viewpoints, and I'm no closer to a final decision. But I think that's instructive, quite honestly. The one thing I would just wrap up with, Chairman, is I think after all of this, whether there's a Secretary Austin or not a Secretary Austin, it might be a good time, apart from a decision on a waiver, to have an even deeper discussion about this point so that we can avoid, I think, the issues that Dr. Cohen has brought up, and that is, how the public views all of this, restoring the confidence they have in us as decision makers on all matters, but especially matters of our national defense. And so that at the very least we can restore their confidence. But also I just think that, to lay down a record that this isn't going to be the norm, even if there are two in a row, that we can help both ourselves and our constituents have a clear commitment that this isn't going to be the norm. And so with that, again, just thank you to all of you. And I look forward to further discussion. I'm certainly looking forward to my meeting with I almost said General. I shouldn't call him General perhaps anymore, but with Mr. Austin. And with that, I'll yield.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Kramer. And on behalf of the chairman, let me recognize Senator Kane and thank him for joining me here in D.C.
Okay. Thank you to our chair and ranking, and thank you to the witnesses. Let me just first begin acknowledging this is the first Senate hearing since the events of last Wednesday, and I just want to make a comment about it. People have sort of tried to describe what happened. Is it a riot? Is it a protest? Is it First Amendment activities? Is it sedition? I think the Constitution that we swear to uphold and defend gives us an answer. The 14th Amendment of the Constitution has a Section 3 that talks about insurrection or rebellion against the Constitution of the United States. And that clause has some significant consequences for those who either engage in that or who give aid and comfort to those who do. What happened was not just a random attack on Congress as an institution. It was an attack that was specifically designed and then fomented and then deployed at a particular moment to obstruct Congress from carrying out the Constitution. Congress was meeting on that day for a purpose, to carry out constitutional and statutory duties to accept certified electoral results from 50 states in the District of Columbia, to supervise the count of those electoral votes and then declare a winner in the 2020 presidential election. That was what the attack was about. It was an attack on the Constitution of the United States. We came together after an attack on the Capitol in 2001 as a Congress in a bipartisan way to ensure that there were consequences, and it's my hope that we can, as a bipartisan Congress, do so again. I also was reminded of a powerful moment in Senate history when a senator took the floor during a debate and said, "God forbid that the day should ever come when to be true to my constituents is to be hostile to the Union." That was a comment made during the debate about the Compromise of 1850 by then Senator Jefferson Davis, who a number of years later chose to violate his oath to the Constitution and the nation, to choose his interests in his constituents, or at least the narrow segment of his constituents who were allowed to vote at the time he chose to elevate their concerns over those of the nation and Constitution. Now, onto this issue. This is such an easy case and such a hard one. It's an easy one because General Austin is so very qualified, and it's important to note, not just qualified as a military leader, he's now been out of the military and he's engaged in significant leadership roles in the private sector and in philanthropic institutions. This is not a person who's just a tunnel vision military guy. It's just that he's not been out long enough. So it's easy in one sense, his qualifications are so notable, and it's incredibly hard in the other sense because this is a very important principle. Dr. Khan, I'm struck by the similarity of your name to Dr. Cohen, who testified before us 4 years ago. Elliot Cohen was one of the witnesses arguing for the Mattis waiver, and he has argued strongly that the circumstances that compelled him to be here before us supporting the waiver 4 years ago don't apply right now. And he has written a piece in the Atlantic to suggest that we should not do it. So this is a really, really hard thing. Let me ask you just this, and I wish I'd researched it. Is this bar of somebody having come through military leadership serving as Secretary of Defense, is there an analogy? Are military leaders barred from being HUD secretaries or CIA directors by law right now? I don't think so. Do you?
No, Senator, there is no analogy. Recently retired military officers are not barred from holding other positions, nor are recently retired Foreign Service officers barred from
State Department, or if you worked at HUD your whole career, you're not barred from being the HUD secretary. This is a very unique limitation and waiver. My colleagues have done a great job of talking about their concerns. Here's mine. I was a governor of Virginia, and I had cabinet secretaries. And those who had significant experience with the agencies they were overseeing were often unwilling to be change makers. They were more loyal to the agencies they'd come up through than they were to the governor saying, we need to make some change in that agency or that cabinet secretariat. And I'm not sure that your testimony really goes to those concerns, but is that a fair concern?
Yes, Senator, absolutely. That is a fair concern. And I think it gets back to Senator Gillibrand's question as well, whether not whether the individual has the integrity to try to do the right thing, but whether the individual is so embedded in the culture and norms of their own institution that they have difficulty thinking about change in certain ways.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Kaine. And now, on behalf of Chairman Inhofe, let me recognize Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the witnesses for holding this important hearing. A lot to consider here. The first question that I had is Senator Cotton made a statement that I just want the witnesses to touch on. He said he doesn't believe civilian control for the military is at risk. I would agree with that. But can you talk a little bit about that issue? I mean, that's a big statement to say it is at risk. Do you believe it's at risk? And how would you have us analyze that important issue?
Thank you, Senator. I think it's important to understand that civilian control is not an on-off switch. It's not either there or not there. It is a web of institutions and norms and practices and understandings, and it can be weakened or strengthened. I think that Senator Cotton's point was well taken. No one that I am aware of thinks that the confirmation or the waiver for Mr. Austin would break the back of either civilian control or American democracy. No one is worried about that. What we are worried about is its role in weakening these norms and institutions and their importance. So I would say, again, there are some ways that this would weaken those norms, and those norms are in danger. We have plenty of research indicating that, again, as I mentioned before, the American public is fairly comfortable turning over its own freedom and self-governance to institutions like the military because they trust them. This is a trend that must be actively worked against. And so if you choose to confirm Mr. Austin and grant him a waiver, I don't think that's the end of civilian control by any means, but it does put us all in a position where we must work extra hard to restore those norms and those institutions.
To dovetail on Dr. Cohn's remarks, the legislative history, the recent legislative history of this provision and associated things also speaks to the way the norm is being extended across the department. So in 2008, the Congress decided to revise the statutory provision from the cooling off period, as we know it, from 10 years to 7 years. The Representative Walter Jones at the time said that he wanted to broaden the candidate pool available to the president for the selection of Secretary of Defense. And as you have noted during this committee's session 4 years ago, there was a lot of discussion about, to what extent, confirming then nominee Secretary Mattis might erode that norm of having civilian control and direction at the top of the department. But it's also worth noting, as a counterpoint to this discussion, that Congress has also strengthened the norm in other ways. In particular, by in recent years extending the statutory cooling off period to key civilian appointments within the Department of Defense. So the Congress appears to have started to look at civilian control of the military and its expression in these appointments more holistically across the department and across these different positions.
Let me ask another, just a comment and then another follow-up question. You mentioned the politics and the partisan nature, not partisan politics, but just politics and all instruments of power of being the CENTCOM commander. So I do think that there's a lot of learning, but also experience a CENTCOM commander would bring. I know that the conventional wisdom starting about General Mattis's tenure is what you two had mentioned. I'm not so sure I fully agree with that. The national defense strategy that the Secretary Mattis put forward, I think is a really important development, positive development, bipartisan development in our national security that most senators agreed with. And it was an important element of the work done by Secretary Mattis. Well, let me ask another question, a little bit of a counterpoint. Right now, as far as I can tell, the incoming Biden administration will have one cabinet official with military experience. That will be, if he's confirmed, the Secretary of Transportation, Mayor Buttigieg, who was a reservist. You mentioned that the Secretary of Defense's one of his roles would be to fight for budgets and other things that relate to the military. If there's does it make sense to also potentially make the case that having cabinet officials, particularly on the national security team, with significant military experience actually helps in this regard? I'd like you to just comment on that. And then that's my final question, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Senator, thank you for the question. In my personal opinion, there are, we have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, whose statutory role is the military advisor to the president, and who is there to help other cabinet members understand and members of the National Security Council understand the issues at stake. I do think it's always helpful for there to be people in these roles that have broad experience, if it's a few years in the military or a few years in the State Department or a few years in a state government, for example. So it's never bad for people to have different kinds of experience. I think the problem is when we start thinking that only people with extensive military experience and backgrounds really understand the issues at stake. I do not agree that that is the case, and therefore I am not concerned when we have a Secretary of Defense who does not have extensive military experience. I think that there are already institutional there are institutional ways in which the Department of Defense, as Dr. McInnes mentioned, is already privileged against most of the other executive departments. I don't think that we need to worry about the military not having a sufficient voice at the table. Thank you.
I thank you very much, Senator Sullivan. And on behalf of the chairman, let me recognize Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Senator Reid. I appreciate it, and I want to thank our presenters today and both of them for their service to our country and the job they do in such a professional way. Let me ask this question, if I may. I think everyone that knows General Austin has met with General Austin or worked with him. We've had him before the committee. I've been there for almost 11 years now. So we've had many times to have General Austin and his most professional application, his common sense approach. So I'm very appreciative of that. What I would like to ask is that, do you all have concerns? First of all, I understand that General Austin did not position himself to where he was aggressively seeking this opportunity or this job. So that was the president's decision, I understand, that basically selected him. Yeah, he did not advocate for it. And on top of that, I understand that I've been very differential to the president putting their staff together who they believe is the right person with the right skill sets at the right time. And I understand that is General Austin, which I believe also. But with that, I was concerned about those down the food chain below him. Can you tell me that as General Austin asked, or are you concerned that General Austin would try to, the people that basically have that separation between military service and civilian, is there any other person asking for waivers, or have we given waivers to anybody else besides the secretary themselves, or considered it? Neither one of you all can, or both of you can answer this.
Senator, my understanding is that no, that has not been, that the statutory waiver has been provided twice for Secretary Mattis and then Secretary Marshall. The extension of the cooling off requirement was done in recent years. I think it was 2016 and 2017. So to my knowledge, that has not been applied since it's been extended.
But let me ask this question here. Did you all see any? Was there a movement that General Mattis wanted to get this waiver for other people? So he wanted more military presence, or people with military services that had been out in a very short period of time? I did not see the concern. I don't know if you all seen something that I haven't. And are you concerned that General Austin would ask for waivers for other people?
Senator, I did not see any such requests from Secretary Mattis, although the White House liaison office and the process of political appointments is a bit of a black box, to say the least. So I wouldn't have seen that. It does speak to, however, the point that you're making, which is the broader national security team, and does the broader team bring the experience, insights, and building savvy to the department and its management. The failure to appoint political appointees in the Office of the Secretary of Defense particularly over the past 4 years, did have an arguably degrading effect on the effectiveness of the Office of the Secretary of Defense. A civil servant serving in an acting capacity does not have the authority to make key decisions on matters of national security strategy and policy, because frankly another boss could come in the next day and reverse everything that they decided. It's a tenuous position to put our civil service in, and unfortunately they've been put in that position frequently recently.
Senator, I would just say no. Mr. Mattis, Secretary Mattis, did not seem to ask for waivers for any of the appointed or Senate-confirmed positions under him. It's my impression that both Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden had or intended to have a fair amount of personal influence and control over those appointments and not delegate that entirely to their secretaries. And so what we saw under Mr. Mattis, under Secretary Mattis, was a tendency to sidestep the civilians, not a tendency to try to put his own people in those positions. In other words, a tendency to rely more on the joint staff because of the kind of personnel vacancy and turmoil that Dr. McInnes has described. So far with Mr. Austin and Mr. Biden, we have not seen, in fact, the Biden team has announced a large number of people that they intend to nominate, all of whom are extremely good qualified civilian choices. And so I do not see a situation here where Mr. Austin is looking to install a number of his military counterparts.
So you're not concerned about that then, as far as the threat of that being basically having a mindset of military control Also, the President-elect Biden has already nominated Kathleen Hicks, Deputy Secretary of Defense, and Colin Kahl, Undersecretary of Defense, and both of those are proven record of civil service and national security. So my question is, should General Austin be confirmed, what other senior leadership positions at the Department of Defense would you suggest he fill with civilians?
All of them?
All of them?
Yes. I mean, again, the danger here...
You agree that people should have a knowledge of how the Department of Defense is supposed to operate, right?
Yeah, of course, Senator. I do not mean that just any civilian is good enough. All of the people who are nominated should have the right experience and expertise to deal appropriately with the extremely complex organization that the Department of Defense is. It simply does not necessarily, and it's perfectly good to nominate people who have some military experience. The difference is whether you take people directly out of military service and put them into civilian positions, or whether you sideline the civilians and rely entirely on the joint staff. But you are correct. I do not see this necessarily being a big problem. I think that this chamber should certainly maintain a sharp eye on the administration, however.
Let me ask both of you this one. Has there ever been any incident in General Austin's history, any incident whatsoever in his history, that would lead you to second-guess his integrity towards professionalism in those command relationships? Should he re-enter the building as Secretary of Defense and be confirmed? Do you have any concerns whatsoever in his ability and anything in his past that would give you concern?
Senator, the overwhelming consensus is that Mr. Austin served his nation with distinction and is very well qualified. But the broader, 4 years ago when this committee considered the question of civilian control of the armed forces, the conversation was very much about the person of the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Defense position as an institution in and of itself. Today the conversation is more about the overall health of civilian-military relations within our society, as well as the overall health of our civilian institutions within our government. So in considering Mr. Austin, considering the broader team is arguably quite important if you take the view that civilian voices have been muted.
Senator, I don't know enough about Mr. Austin's personal history to be able to answer that question, but I have no reason to doubt his integrity.
We've reached the time limit, Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Senator Manchin. Now I'm going to call on Senator Blackburn on behalf of the chairman. There might be some technical difficulties, but let's see if we can recognize Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm not going to turn my video on because I think part of the transmission problem is with the video, and I want to thank our witnesses for a very thoughtful discussion as we look at this and look at the civilian control of the military. And one question that I have is, how does it affect our international security advantages that we enjoy? You look around the globe and look at the Philippines, and where you've got a president who has essentially militarized his domestic police force. You look at Burma, where there's a democratic transition away from military rule, and the precarious situation there, or to Thailand, or to Sri Lanka, or to Indonesia. So my one question, and I will go ahead and mute myself, just a quick response on what you see is the effect that it has on our international security, if there is, and you may feel that there is none.
Thank you, Senator. I think this is a good question. I really think the only concern that we would have is that there are many states out there whose officials prefer to interact with military officers because they, in some cases, feel that validates their own form of government. In some cases, feel that the military is where the power lies. I think, again, we might look at that and say, oh, this is a good reason to nominate someone who was recently retired as a 4-star, and that may be your view of the matter. My personal view is that the United States should lead by example in having civilians carry the political power and be the ones making the decisions. And again, of course, Mr. Austin is a civilian at this point. I am not arguing that he is going to go around wearing his uniform. But again, this is a more subtle issue of perception, tendency for officials of other countries to refer to him still as general. And Mr. Austin can mitigate these problems. But I think you are making a very good point that how other countries see us and see our form of government is one of the things at stake here. Thank you.
Senator, just to, again, dovetail onto Dr. Cohn's point, it is a reminder of the relative imbalance that we have seen build over the past, arguably, 20 years. Between the Department of Defense and the other agencies of national power. The common argument that is expressed is that when foreign governments interact with the United States government, do they look to the ambassador in the country or do they look to the combatant commander? And given that the combatant commander has his own plane and he's got this massive staff and he's got all the trappings of power in our system, there is a perception that exists that they have more relative power within our system than the civilians that are leaders of our system. So there's a broader set of trends to consider when looking at this particular question of the Secretary's role and standing as viewed internationally.
Senator Blackburn, do you have contact with us?
I don't know if you can hear me or not. That is all of my questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Blackburn. On behalf of Chairman Inhofe, let me recognize Senator King.
We are.
Senator King, do you have...
Yes, I'm here. I'm here. Okay. Thank you. Before I begin, it's commonplace in our world to compliment and thank one another, but I want to go beyond that and compliment and thank and express my deep appreciation to Chairman Inhofe and Senator Reid for your leadership in the passage of the National Defense Bill at the end of the year. That was an extraordinary moment, a very important one for the country. It took courage, perseverance, vision, all the attributes of leadership. So I really sincerely want to convey that. Since this is the first time we've gotten together since that session. This is a very deep and difficult issue. There are a couple of principles involved. One is the president gets to choose their own people. That's a good idea. I've always supported it. This part of it is that General Austin is well qualified. I'm impressed. I met with him recently, very impressed by his breadth of knowledge and experience. But on the other hand, the whole idea of the military and a separation from civilian and military, a fundamental part of who we are. The framers recognized it explicitly. They dealt with military and they were very concerned about the idea of a standing army. And we've crossed that Rubicon. We have a standing army. And to me, this statute made sense in 2017, and it makes sense today. And if we provide two waivers, it seems to me the statute, and I don't know why that statute was passed. Now let me turn to a question. Chairman Inhofe, in his introductory remarks, used a word that I haven't heard since, and that is there a unique set of qualifications that General Austin brings to this position that would necessitate us waiving the statutory provision and I think essentially gutting it. So can either of the witnesses talk about the word unique and whether General Austin has unique qualities that could not be found anywhere else in order to fill this position in the incoming administration?
Senator, thank you. It is a question for this Congress and for the President to determine the uniqueness of the qualities of the proposed nominee and whether or not they satisfy your criteria of the uniqueness. It again begs this broader question of the overall system of the Department of Defense, and whether or not, again, the position of Secretary of Defense is extremely difficult. There's so many different challenges, and as Secretary of Defense Robert Gates noted, we have a pretty near perfect track record of predicting the next conflict. We've gotten it right 0% of the time. As a result, is this nominee the person that can and the team more broadly be prepared to both look at current challenges and also be able to address the longer term health capability development, so on and so forth for the future. It's an incredibly difficult job, and it really does require a great team to support them. If the civilian side of the Department of Defense is not capable, because for all sorts of human resources kinds of reasons, to be able to provide that support, then I think that begs a bigger question of what to do.
Perhaps I framed the question improperly. Dr. Cohn, do you believe that the word unique has some value here, and is that a standard that we should apply? I'm trying to get some help on how to make this decision, and is a guide to the decision. Yes, you should provide the waiver if the individual brings unique qualities to the table at this particular moment in time. Is that a valid basis that we should refer in making our decision?
Senator, I would not presume to tell this chamber its business. And with all due respect to Senator Inhofe, I do think that the use of the word unique is maybe setting the bar a little bit too high. As Dr. McInnes has pointed out, this is a very difficult job, and it's almost impossible to find someone who is uniquely qualified for it in some way or has unique characteristics that make them the only appropriate person for it. So I think maybe the word unique is a bit too exclusive. If you were simply asking me my personal opinion, I would say that this chamber could think about its decision more in terms of whether the person involved can convince them that the concerns that we have raised and that have been raised by members of this committee can be sufficiently mitigated that the damage will not be greater than the value of that person being in office and all of the things that they bring to that office. If this chamber decides that Mr. Austin is ready and capable to strengthen civilian control, as I believe Senator Rounds pointed out, if this chamber believes that Mr. Austin is going to handle things extremely well, then this chamber could, I think, very legitimately come to the conclusion that on balance it is better to give him a waiver and confirm him. On the other hand, as you point out, the question here is: was this the only possible choice? No, clearly it was not the only possible choice, but it is the choice that the president-elect has made, and that has put you in the position of determining whether the balance is good or bad, and I do not envy you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator King. Now, on behalf of Chairman Inhofe, let me recognize Senator Warren.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So civilian control of the military isn't just about who leads the Department of Defense. It's about how decisions throughout the department get made, who's at the table, whose voice gets listened to. The last time that Congress changed federal law to let a general run DOD was in 2017. And the November 2018 National Defense Strategy Commission report, published a month before Secretary Mattis stepped down, highlighted the consequences of this move. So I want to read from their report. They said, civilian voices have been relatively muted on issues at the center of U.S. defense and national security policy, undermining the concept of civilian control. The implementation of the National Defense Strategy must feature empowered civilians fulfilling their statutory responsibilities, particularly regarding issues of force management. It is critical that DoD and Congress reverse the unhealthy trend in which decision-making is drifting away from civilian leaders on issues of national importance. Dr. Cohn, do you agree with that characterization, and do you think it remains true today at the end of the Trump administration?
Yes, Senator, I do agree with the characterization, and I do think it remains true today.
Thank you. But Dr. McInnes, regardless of who is the next Secretary of Defense, what does that individual need to do to restore the balance between OSD and the Joint Staff?
Thank you, Senator. If you agree that the civilian pillar within the Department of Defense ought to be strengthened because, or as it follows from civilian voices being muted, then there's some simple sort of human resources fixes that can be applied to addressing this. Thinking about the workforce health of the National Security Civil Service and within the Office of the Secretary of Defense in particular. Thinking about things like the implications of furloughs. You know, OSD civilians are furloughed when there's shutdowns. Their joint staff counterparts are not. Thinking through things like to what extent civilian voices are included in process and planning reviews and war plan reviews. Is that adequate? It's such a multifaceted set of issues that one could easily see not only the next Secretary of Defense paying considerable attention to it, but also there's a number of congressional tools that might be applied to this, including maybe establishing a commission or in doing hearings, so on and so forth.
All right, good. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. You know, one of my Republican colleagues, I don't know who because it was done anonymously, but one of my Republican colleagues gave a quote to the New York Times reporter expressing regret over their vote to grant Secretary Mattis a waiver, saying that Secretary Mattis ran the department, quote, more like a supersized combatant commander. Dr. Cohn, an imbalance in civil-military relations sounds bad, but what I really want to understand is what does it mean in practice? Why is it a problem if the military decision makers on the Joint Chiefs of Staff are in fact running the show?
Thank you, Senator. The way I would characterize this is basically as a difference in logic. In the military, and I'm not saying that every person in the military has this mindset exclusively, but it is normal and natural for the military to want overwhelming resources, overwhelming force, to be allowed to use that force in as unrestrained a manner as possible, because that is how you win battles with the fewest losses on your own side. And if you spend all of your time thinking about and planning for certain types of contingencies, those are the types of solutions that you are most likely to reach for when new and unexpected situations come up. The difference between that kind of mentality, or that kind of what I would call logic, and what I would call a political logic, is thinking about how to use force, the threat of force, the information gained through the use of force as part of a larger bargaining action, as part of a larger political goal or a political aim or a political strategy that seeks to accomplish things that are in the national interest more broadly, rather than in the narrow interest of say, winning battles or winning wars. Wars and battles are only useful if they accomplish some kind of political end, and that requires somebody there who understands how the use of force can be used in bargaining. Thank you.
Thank you. That's actually very helpful. Thank you. You know, civilian control of the military is a bedrock principle in our country since its founding. And since 1947, we've put that into practice by choosing secretaries of defense from civilian life. And I believe in this principle deeply, and it's why I voted against rewriting federal law for Jim Mattis, and it's why I'll do the same for Lloyd Austin. If Congress grants Mr. Austin a waiver, I'll consider his nomination independently on the merits. And regardless of who the next Secretary of Defense is, it is clear that a lot of work must be done to restore civilian voices to their proper balance in the decision-making process at the Defense Department. So I stand ready to work with anyone who is willing to help make sure that happens. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warren. And on behalf of Senator Inhofe, let me recognize Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our witnesses today for your testimony. I know I've heard from Dr. Cohn and others about the 7-year timeline, and I think you mentioned in your testimony it's somewhat arbitrary, although you could take a look at the fact that it's a couple tours of duty, which there's some separation with that. You've also been asked about what sort of characteristics or uniqueness that a nominee may have that would warrant this. And I know that's all very kind of difficult to answer, but as we try to sort this through, I would ask both of you, are there any kind of activities in a post-military career of a service member that might demonstrate that they've created some of the separation between their current civilian perspective and their previous military one? So it's not just an individual saying, well, of course I will do this, but is there some sort of, my question is there some sort of objective look at the type of activities that they've been engaged in, or perhaps some of their personal characteristics that they may have that would help us better understand whether or not that separation exists? And I guess I'll start with you, Dr. Cohn.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, you are pointing to a really important issue, which is how does one tell when someone has become civilian enough? And I would say, just off the top of my head, somebody who has gone in to work in another agency, another government agency, or someone who has worked in maybe a non-governmental organization, that kind of experience, again, sort of policy experience, and the experience of having to try to wrangle multiple competing concerns. Not that people in the military have no experience with that, but just outside of their familiar sphere, so to speak. And in terms of personal characteristics, also, of course, executive experience at a firm or a company would also help. In terms of their personal characteristics, I think some of the things that have already been mentioned today in terms of, a willingness to embrace the political nature of the position, a willingness to come forward and do the kinds of things that would have been very unusual and abnormal for that person in their previous position, an ability to sort of see things from other perspectives, and a commitment, and a clear commitment to the idea that that there must be mutual respect for different kinds of experience and expertise. In other words, someone who does not look around them and think the only people here that I can trust to know what they're doing are other military officers. The person must demonstrate a respect for and a belief in other kinds of expertise.
Thank you. Dr. McInnes, is that a pretty comprehensive list, or would you concur with that or add anything, or would that be sufficient?
Yeah, once again, I'm just reminded that the consideration of the management and leadership team of the Department of Defense as a team, it's not just the person of the Secretary of Defense and the particular qualities that they bring to the game. It's also who are the service secretaries, who are the undersecretaries. Do they have together as a team the set of skills that you feel, this chamber feels, is necessary to accomplish the national security business of the United States?
I have in the remaining time, I'm going to ask a big question, so if you could be brief, I think it'll be helpful. We've already granted 2 waivers that we've already discussed here in the during this hearing. What would each of you consider the major lesson that we have learned from those waivers that we should be conscious of, either positive or negative, and how would you compare that to the present situation?
Senator, to be brief, I think the main lesson that we have learned from those 2 experiences is that there is a danger of over-deference on the part of such a secretary, over-deference to the military voice, to the military position, and to their military friends and colleagues. So that's the main lesson that I would draw and be concerned about.
I would just add on that one of the major concerns expressed is how that actually manifests down the chain. How does that manifest in terms of planning, oversight, and the day-to-day business of civilian-military relations?
Thank you both for your answer. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Peters. And now let me recognize on behalf of the chairman, Senator Duckworth. I understand there might be some technical issues. Senator Duckworth.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, both Chairman Reed and Chairman Inhofe. Again, I second our colleague Angus King's compliments to you both for successfully shepherding another NDAA through the process. I do not have video. That is the technical issue we have. However, I do have a statement, and I'd like to just start by saying that I want to open by acknowledging that I did not vote for an exception to statute for Secretary Mattis to serve as Secretary of Defense, and I have publicly stated that I do not support an exception for General Austin. I believe very strongly that there needs to be civilian oversight of the military. And while it's true that Lloyd Austin is no longer wearing the uniform, he retired from active service just 4 years ago. The waiver that Congress is considering would address the statutory requirement that military retirees wait 7 years from leaving regular service in the armed forces before they serve as SecDef. I believe this waiting period is very important. It has already been discussed today. And I think the length of time matters. In fact, I don't think 7 years is long enough. The original 10-year waiting period wisely intended to prevent the type of conflicts that arise when recently retired military commanders oversee leaders in the ranks that they have personal relationships with. I remain disappointed that the legal requirements enshrined in this principle were reduced in 2007 without any congressional debate. The military is a much smaller community than it may seem to people who haven't served, especially as service members work their way up through the ranks, and that pyramid gets steeper and steeper. 4-star generals have spent decades in this community and likely know the combatant commanders and service chiefs very well. Oftentimes, they've grown up together for the majority of their professional lives, and in some cases, they have shared enormous hardship and harrowing experiences in combat. I trust that most of our general officers are professionals and know that they have spent their careers making hard choices. But a Secretary of Defense having personal relationships with the majority of the highest-ranking uniform leaders still puts them in a difficult situation. It also means that the top supposedly civilian leader and the top military leaders have very similar professional backgrounds and have spent their entire adult lives in the same military culture. And I don't think that's healthy, because I appreciate the diversity of experience and perspective brought by a secretary who has a different resume and professional trajectory than the generals that they lead. I have serious reservations about the erosion of civilian leadership over our military, one of the foundational principles of our country, and one that I personally risk my own life to defend. I value the service and experience of our military officers, but I value our leaders who spend their careers in civilian service as well. These different populations are supposed to complement each other, act as checks and balances on each other when necessary. This is healthy for democracy. I don't want a military career to become a prerequisite for an appointment to the cabinet. We saw this impulse at the beginning of the Trump administration when Trump showed a brief but troubling fascination with bragging about his, and I quote, generals. The Senate confirmed those appointments out of fear and a desire to surround Trump with adults in the room. As much as I didn't trust Trump, I thought approving an exception to statute for Jim Mattis was unwise then, and I certainly think granting another exception is unwise now. Now is the time to shore up our democratic principles, not to continue to tear them down. That being said, I think it's important to acknowledge, especially now in light of the violent insurrection at our Capitol last week, that I respect the majority rule of my colleagues. I will not vote for an exception to statute to allow someone with just 7 years of relief from active service to be appointed I will not vote for an exception to statute to allow someone who is still within the 7 years of relief from active service to be appointed as Secretary of Defense. However, if my colleagues choose to do so, I will accept their decision and consider Lloyd Austin's nomination fairly and on its merits. I would like to close by acknowledging retired General Lloyd Austin, President-elect Biden's nominee to be Secretary of Defense, is an excellent nominee. While I cannot vote for the exception to statute that would allow him to serve as our next Secretary of Defense, my objection has everything to do with the issues I've just outlined and nothing to do with the man himself. Lloyd Austin served honorably and faithfully for more than 40 years. He broke barriers the entire way and commanded troops, often in combat, with integrity and compassion. I hold Lloyd Austin in the highest esteem and thank him for all that he's done for our country. If Congress passes legislation waiving the requirement for a 7-year waiting period and confirms Lloyd Austin, I have no doubt that he'll bring his trademark dedication and steady leadership to the role of Secretary of Defense. However, I stand firm in my conviction that the principle of civilian control of the military is bigger than any one person or his personal experiences or resume. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield the rest of my time.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Duckworth. I believe that completes all of our colleagues who wish to participate. On behalf of Chairman Inhofe, let me thank the witness for your superb testimony, your insights. You have informed us extraordinarily well, and we leave this hearing much better informed on this very critical topic. With that,
Senator Reid?
Yes.
Let me make just one comment here.
Absolutely.
First of all, I do appreciate Angus King's comments about the NDAA. It was difficult, and everyone performed well. I look back and see that I looked up the vote that took place with Mattis, and it was 81-17 to grant the waiver at that time. I'm not suggesting that would set any precedent for what we're considering now. And I also want to mention, since I've had some comments and some questions from members of the committee, that we don't know, Senator Reid and I, because of the unusual circumstances, don't know yet when we're going to actually have a nomination hearing or how this vote is going to take place. There's some notion that it might have been on the 19th, or it might be at the 21st. And just to state the obvious, I would be transferring the chairmanship on the 20th. So that would mean either one of us would be the chairman at that time, which really doesn't make any difference. So we can't answer the obvious question as to when this vote would take place, and then how long afterwards there'd be a nomination hearing. I have talked to both John Bonzo and Liz King, and we're considering this right now, and Senator Reid and I will be talking to kind of work through the next steps, and we'll advise the members of the committee as soon as we do that, okay? And again, I want to thank the witnesses, Drs. Khan and McGinnis. This has been very helpful to me. One of the things about being a chairman, you don't come and go, you just stay for the entire hearing, and this was one that was really very beneficial to me. And I want to thank Senator Reid, I want to thank you for chairing this committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I think you should gavel out. You're the chairman.
Oh, all right. We are now adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.